Yeah, so in this video, I wanted to cover a topic, briefly cover a topic that I've thought about a little bit, not too much, haven't thought about too much, but in any case, I want to talk about the value of altruism in non-changes. So far as I can tell, altruism has extreme evolutionary value, and acting altruistically has extreme evolutionary value. However, acting altruistically seems to only have value in reciprocal exchanges. So what I mean by that is if two people are behaving altruistically toward each other, altruism works. However, if it's non-reciprocal, as in one individual is behaving altruistically and another individual is behaving non-altruistically, then altruism has little value, and actually has a counter value, as in a negative value, rather than a positive value. So in reciprocal exchanges, two individuals behaving altruistically to each other simultaneously, altruism is valuable. In non-reciprocal exchanges, one individual altruistic, the other non-altruistic, altruism has a negative value rather than a positive. It does not have value. It has anti-value. So in any case, my idea is this, that we regard it culturally as a virtue to be selfless, as it were, and selfishness is regarded as a non-virtue. Selflessness and self-sacrifice are both regarded as virtues. However, one issue with being selfless or altruistic by default is that what could end up happening is your altruism, your tendency to be altruistic, your tendency to act selflessly, can be exploited by non-selfless, self-interested, selfish other agents that are acting out of self-interest rather than altruism. In that sense, we think that it's a virtue to, by default, behave selflessly. However, to behave selflessly by default and not in a calculated way is a bad thing, because ultimately what it could lead to is the selfless person being exploited by a person acting selflessly. Opens themselves up to exploitation by acting selflessly toward a person who is not reciprocating with altruism or selflessness. So being selfless by default opens one up to exploitation from those who are acting non-altruistically or by pure self-interest or selfishness. In this sense, the selfless can end up being consumed by the selfish. So we should not regard it as a virtue by default, or as a positive, or as a good thing, a thing with utility by default to behave altruistically or selflessly in any given context. What it could lead to is a default mode of behaving altruistically could lead to exploitation of the altruistic at the hands of the non-altruistic, or those who are acting on pure self-preservation, self-interest, and selfishness. So we regard it as some sort of, again, we regard it as some sort of virtue to behave selflessly by default. Ultimately, though, we have to consider the other side of the coin, where it's certainly possible that a person that behaves selflessly by default ends up only being exploited by those who are behaving selfishly rather than selflessly. So it shouldn't be regarded as a virtue by default. Now, as a secondary issue, why behave selflessly when you'll only end up being exploited by the selfish in the process? The selfish exploiting your selflessness to gain, right, at your expense and on their behalf. So it's well, my thinking on that ultimately started as a quip, but became a larger statement about whether altruism has value by default in non-reciprocal situations where altruism is not reciprocated by other members of the tribe, where selfless individuals acting altruistically are exploited by those who behave out of self-interest non-altruistically or selfishly, by which those acting non-altruistically or on pure self-interest and selfishness merely use the selflessness of the altruistically behaving person for their own gain, exploit that altruism to ultimately turn a virtue into a vice. So, yeah, and in that sense, behaving altruistically by default can generate exploitation, can produce exploitation of those who are behaving altruistically. So behaving altruistically by default could lead to exploitation of the altruistic at the hands of those that have decided to act on self-interest or non-altruistically or on selfishness. So in that sense, altruism can also produce exploitation of the altruistic, which we would regard as an absolute negative. Again, that virtue then being transmuted into vice. So anyway, I do like thinking about the ethics of these types of whether we should behave in particular ways ethically, because ethics is an area of discovery where we haven't distilled ethics into a science. So it ends up actually being an area of very intriguing ambiguity. But in any case, and an area where logic can do a lot of work in terms of trying to refine our ethical mores and tropes and trying to figure out what works ethically and what doesn't in the real world in a pragmatic, utilitarian sense. And I do think that secular ethics can be derived via a utilitarian framework of thought, looking at the costs and benefits of different actions in a game situation, and then judging the ethicalness of those actions based on the value they either create or destroy. So ethics becomes a kind of system, and figuring out how to act in terms of the proper ethics becomes a kind of game that can be played via a kind of propositional logic or a utilitarian logic. So in any case, this also ties into striking a balance maybe between collectivist and individualist philosophies, where too much individualism can produce greed and self-interest and individuals acting at the expense of the collective to serve their own interests. On the other hand, too much collectivism could lead to situations in which individual rights and dignities are violated to serve the collective. So we have to figure out how to strike balances between competing ethical philosophies. And at least with regard to altruism, it becomes very important for one to decide in a very calculated fashion when altruism would generate value and when it would destroy value. If you're in a non-reciprocal exchange, an individual is behaving non-altruistically and you're behaving altruistically, then altruism has anti-value. It could lead to your exploitation at the hands of those that are acting non-altruistically. So in that sense, altruism by default can produce exploitation, which we would regard as a negative. On the other hand, if the altruism is reciprocated and the two individuals are acting altruistically toward one another, then altruism may have a positive value, but not in a non-reciprocal exchange. This also ties into the difference. Altruism is a big part of the idea of collectivism, and they're very related concepts, altruism and collectivism. And collectivists generally, altruism is acting in some sense with the other or the whole in mind, out of their concern rather than your own interest. And so, yeah, it's a very interesting concept, how the value of altruism and non-reciprocal exchanges then leads us to a broader discussion on the value of competing ethical philosophies and like collectivism and individualism, and which are direct opposites. If you were to ask what is the opposite of individualism, well, I don't know if they're opposites necessarily. You could have collectivism and individualism reconciled into a single system, which is why socialism, I would identify as a socialist and an individualist simultaneously. Regardless, we have to think very critically about when we decide to trade, to sacrifice value on sacrifice self-interest and value for the betterment of another. We have to be very critical about when we decide to act altruistically and when we do not, and when we should act altruistically and when we should not. We have to be very critical and calculated about when that's advantageous and when it's not, when it has value and when it has anti-value. And so, regardless, that, yeah, so on the one hand, we can't be too altruistic. It could lead to us being exploited by individuals who act non-altruistically or on self-interest. They'll simply use our altruism for their own gain. The value that we sacrifice, they'll simply consume. So we have to be very careful about when to act altruistically, because it could just lead us to being exploited in some way by those that would act non-altruistically in response, that would not reciprocate the altruism. On the other hand, if the other person is reciprocating the altruism, there may be a different solution to be derived there. In any case, being critical about the decision to act altruistically or non-altruistically is extremely important when trying to make good, not just ethical decisions, but making good utilitarian decisions, and being a good utilitarian and trying to determine how we should act in the real world and in different situations and contexts. So we have to bring both an ethical and utilitarian calculus to these decisions. And if we can't consider with any positive virtue that our society recognizes, we could just as easily point out a negative, right? Virtue is a vice, which is why ethics is an area of very intriguing ambiguity, because there are always two sides to every situation and two ways of looking at the same thing. And so, in one sense, we regard altruism as this virtue by default, whereas it's far more wise for us to recognize that there are situations in which altruism is a negative. And we have to be critical about when we choose to act altruistically because of the risk of simply being exploited by those who would act non-altruistically in response and would not reciprocate the altruism. We can bring that to our relationships and to our, if we were altruistic by default, why would we regard altruism as a virtue? It would be done out of obligation rather than a sense of virtue. So I don't know. To say that we are obligated to be altruistic negates the virtue in altruism, because then we're simply doing it out of obligation rather than a genuine quality of being good or right. So again, to preserve the currency so as not to inflate the currency, we should minimize the extent to which we engage with others altruistically, because otherwise altruism is no longer regarded as a value or a virtue, because then everyone's doing it by default. So to preserve something there, if that's even worth preserving or necessary to preserve, it may not be. I'd have to think about that more. But in any case, hopefully you enjoyed this topic.